One thing I have noticed with these track cleaning locomotives is that they do not like switches, especially if there's a bunch of them in a row. Usually I end up cleaning the switches by hand, but for this video I showed what happens most of the time, especially when the pads on the cleaning pads on the locomotive start to get wore out. It really fetches up on the switches and just stops it. Now I do have the selector dial turned down quite a bit. You see I turn it back up to go full speed and forward there again. But most of the time when it's running full speed, it'll go over the switches, at least on my main line part of the track. But in this section where I have all the switches for the yard, usually like I said, I just clean all this with the LGB cleaning block. And then I just let it do the long runs in the switch yard. Well, here it is, the LGB track cleaning locomotive. You saw in the first part of the video of it running around my layout. It's been about a year since I changed the pads out on it. So you can see to get to it, you gotta turn it upside down. There's a couple screws you gotta take apart. And obviously there's some grass and some other junk that get wrapped around the wheels on it. But the first thing you gotta do to change the wheels out, you gotta take out the two screws right there for a little retaining plate that holds the gearbox in place. You take those two out, and then you gotta slide it backwards, and it lifts right out. Now to get the motor block or the gearbox out of the front of it, since it articulates, usually gotta start bending it in half there, like you see, and lets it drop down. Then you can pull it backwards and right out. Be careful when doing this though, because the wires, especially on the older ones, because this thing's from 1995, so the wires are starting to get brittle on some of them. I already soldered them because they snapped in half once on me. That and the little plugs can come out too at the end of the motor there. Just is something to make sure you keep an eye on when you're pulling it out, not to pull too hard or too far on it. And if you do, you just gotta solder the wires back together. Right, here you can see how worn down those are. Usually I'd let them go to the point where the locomotive, the front of it, will start bouncing really bad and come off the track, or the pads themselves will come apart. But for this video, I changed them a little bit earlier than I normally would. Now for me, as much as I run this locomotive, I can usually get about 1.5 years out of these before I have to change them out. Of course, that varies on how much you use them and how big your layout is. I use this about once every 2 weeks, all year round. But you see here, once you have the motor block up, there's 2 flathead screws on both sides. Take those out, and then the whole thing just kind of slides off the axle there. Now these are square, so it'll force it to turn with it. So when you go to put them back on, you got to make sure you line those up properly, or else they're not going to slide back on. But there you can see all the grass and the hair and everything else gets caught up in those, especially running them outside. So that's definitely a good time to clean that up and make sure there's nothing else caught in there. Well, there's the old wheel sets. See how they kind of go together. There's quite the groove worn in that one. That's another reason why I don't like to go over the switches once they start to wear in. That groove really forces it backwards. Now these are newer ones made by Marklin. This is actually a little bit older bag by Marklin. It's actually made in Germany still. Some of the newer ones are made in Hungary. But these come with new flathead screws, the plastic parts, and obviously the wheels themselves, the grinding wheels. And you see there the new one on the right, the old one on the left. And that's what it is. Now you can see on the plastic part of the wheels, there's little dimples on them, raised dimples to help hold the cleaning part in place. Kind of clamps down on it when you go to tighten the screw in, keeps it from spinning freely in there. So when you go to put those on, just make sure you press it into those little marks, and then it kind of locks it in. That, and you just kind of gotta line it up, and then it just slides right back on. And there it is, both sides back together. Now another thing I usually do when I have the pads apart is I take the cover of the motor block off, and I'll put a little bit of grease on the big drive gear in there to make sure that's lubricated so that doesn't tear itself up over time. See, you take those 3 screws out, and the cover just pops right off. So you see you got the motor in there, and the big gear that drives it. So if you either strip the gear out or you cook the motor somehow, you can get to all that by accessing taking that apart. See, I just put a little dab of grease. This is Pico gear lubricant. Put a little bit of that on there. Spin it around, make sure everything looks good, then close it back up. Okay, now this is the part you gotta watch out to make sure you don't chafe the wires or make them come disconnected from the back of the motor. You just gotta kind of gently tuck everything in there. Once again, you gotta lift up on the locomotive itself to bend the middle part of it down, kind of get that to slide back enough for those little tabs to lock into the front. Now if you go to set this thing back on the track and go to clean with it and the front motor doesn't spin where the wheels are at, then you probably got to take this back apart to make sure everything's hooked up correctly and none of the wires came apart. That, and the last thing you gotta do is put this little retaining plate back in. This is probably the worst part, trying to get the screws lined up in the holes to get it seated back down. Of course, you'll see here in a minute I drop one of the screws down into the middle of the track cleaning locomotive. I had to fish it back out. Once you get these back down and snug, then it's ready to go again. Now, of course, while you're changing the pads out of the front, it's a good time to clean the rest of the locomotive's wheels, especially where the power pickups are at. But that's just a standard LGB motor block on that short shaft motor. As you can see there, the first and last number on the stickers on the LGB locomotives resembles the year, so that's from 1995, that one. You see my my collection of parts from changing the pads out over the years. See all the plastic bits and the flathead screws I have. This is another thing, if you buy one of these used and it doesn't work in the front, there's a little selector switch in there so you can just run this like a regular locomotive. So if it's not working in the front, the wheels aren't turning the opposite way, then you should definitely check in the cab before you go tearing anything apart to make sure that switch is in the right position. But yeah, there it is, all done back together. Makes a mess of your hands, you might want to put gloves on. And don't have fancy clothes on if you go to change this out.